Professor Titulola Obilade, Associate Professor, Public Health, NIL University, Abuja, joins us from Abuja studios. Thank you for joining us on the program. What's your take on the pandemic treaty being proposed by the WHO in light of the coronavirus pandemic?
Good evening, and thanks for having me, Millicent. I'll say it's a good proposal, but it tells us, first of all, what the enemy is, and that is the virus itself. We've had more than a year, like 18 months now, to know much more about the virus, and we've now also known the weaknesses of the countries. We have our G7 countries. Those countries were able to amass a lot of vaccines. I'm talking of something like, let's say, like Canada. You know, we had like 5 times what it actually needed. And then there were countries in Africa, the African nations, that didn't have enough. And then also, prior to that, we had a deficiency or what I'll call hoarding of information. You know, countries that had information, you know, on vaccines, they were kind of hoarding those the information we needed. So we've seen these programs coming up. But countries like the G7, you know, those 7 countries, in totality, the amount of wealth they carry, it's more than half of the rest of the world. So they are in a position of power, okay? And we have to look at ourselves, the rest, what I'll call the others, don't have so much power. And the global watchdog, WHO, does not have enough funds. That's why we have the COVAX. So it cannot do everything by itself. It needs the cooperation of all these countries, most especially the G7 countries, okay? Because they determine a lot of things, okay? Now, that aside, we also have to look at the rest of the world, the leadership in all the other countries. Look at the African countries that come into play, the instability in governance, okay, the insecurity in governance, the insecurity in the wars, civil wars. Those kind of instabilities kind of put the virus in a place where it can thrive, okay, because with instability comes poverty. With poverty comes a lot of poor infrastructure, health systems are weakened. And so when the pandemic strikes, it's almost impossible to tackle it. And we've seen that not only in African nations, but we've also seen it in other developing nations, other developing economies. So what the WHO has proposed is good in itself, but it also not only depends on human behavior, but it also depends on the leadership of different nations, especially the G7 nations. And then we're also looking at the tech giants. I'm talking about the big 4. You know, we're talking about the Amazon, Facebook, Google, and we're talking about Apple. You know, essentially, a lot of these tech companies have made so much money.
Just as we wrap up,
this is what's going on.
Knowing that it won't be easy to implement such a treaty or agreement by all member countries, also seeing how previous treaties have gone in the past, what do you think Nigeria can learn from this? And this is essentially how we internally can prevent another pandemic.
Using the analogy of the virus being an unseen enemy, we've come to know what it is like within the past 18 months. So the lessons we have learned is we've got to be prepared. The technology we need, the human resources we need, the logistics we need, and the money to make it all run. These are things we need to place on ground. It's not enough to say, okay, our health budget is never up to at par with what we need it to be. Okay, let's use what we have. Okay, and then you also want to come into play. You want to bring your primary health care into play. But most importantly, you need human resources. Then you need human behavior to change. Because what is driving the pandemic is human behavior. And to be able to change that human behavior, you need to educate them. Health education is important. If you are able to carry the people along, you are able to be transparent with them. You're able to communicate with them that this pandemic is not over. The treaty doesn't mean it's an end in itself. There can be other pandemics, there'll be other pandemics, but let the human behavior right now begin to be a way of change to prevent, or in case it does happen again, to kind of mitigate the effects of a future pandemic. And what human behaviors am I talking about? Social gatherings, sanitization, all these non-pharmaceutical methods, we need to let it become ingrained in us as part of our human behaviors, because those are things that can cause the spread. In addition, you also want to look at things like climate change, because looking at the origin of the viruses, we're thinking that, okay, it has something to do with human behavior interacting with the environment, okay? We'll talk about forests, the trees being cut down, and so we're looking at human interference, and then we're saying that perhaps the virus has jumped into the human. So those are things we've got to look at. We've got to really get
quite
to the
a lot of
issues.
You're quite right, Professor Titilola Bilade.
Yes.
Wish we had more time, but we always appreciate your time, your insight into the issues. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me, Listen. Take care now.